Welcome back to another Beyond Clean Expert Series. You're watching the Chemical Safety Expert Series with Alex Hilliker. I'm your host, Bobby Parker, and on today's episode, we're asking what the PEL? The PEL, the Permissible Exposure Limit, something that's set by OSHA. When we think about chemical safety in general, OSHA is kind of the first organization that comes to mind. And so on today's episode, we want to ask Alex about all of the exposure limits that OSHA sets for us. So Alex, welcome back to another episode. Let's dive right into this one. Can you tell us about the different kinds of exposure limits that OSHA has set around hazardous chemical vapors?
Yeah, good to be back, Bobby. Let's start very broad. Let's start with what is OSHA, who is OSHA in the first place, because I think OSHA gets thrown around a lot, but where did that all start? So OSHA was actually created by the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, for those of you that just kind of go by the acronym. And the whole reason OSHA exists is to make sure that workers in the United States are safe. And so they set and enforce standards, but they also provide training, they provide outreach, they provide assistance to companies and organizations that might need it in terms of figuring out the best way to keep their team members safe. And so relevant to chemical safety, the topic of this series, OSHA creates and enforces something called permissible exposure limits, or PELs. So just like it sounds, a PEL is the legal limit for the concentration of a specific target chemical for what a person can be safely exposed to over a given time period. So PELs are typically expressed in terms of a time-weighted average. There is a long-term exposure limit that's often cited as the PEL, and that's an 8-hour time-weighted average. And so that is the amount that, the average amount that you should be exposed to over the course of a typical shift. There's also a short-term exposure limit. You'll hear people refer to this as the STEL, and that is a 15-minute time-weighted average. And when we think about the difference between a PEL and a STEL, the PEL is actually typically a little bit lower than what the STEL will be. And the reason for that is what we're exposed to acutely in the short term is typically a little bit more than what we can or should be exposed to in the long term over the course of an 8-hour shift.
That makes sense. And I could see why both would be needed, right? Because if you are exposed to a chemical and had a spike in exposure maybe in hour 4 of your shift, but it was 0 for the rest of your shift, I could see how maybe that would average out to be under that time-weighted average.
Sure. Yep.
But that doesn't mean that spike is okay. So we need to need to have both exposure limits. So how are these exposure limits expressed? Like, is there a particular measurement that's used for those?
Yeah, so the unit of measurement that is used is a part per million.
Gotcha. Okay, and that sounds very small. I'm leading into this, Alex, because you and I have had several conversations about this in previous CE conversations about how small that is. But why don't you give us some of those famous Alex illustrations of just how small is 1 part per million?
Yeah. So just specially for the expert series, Bobby, we're going to dust off some fresh analogies.
Okay.
To be able to visualize and understand what 1 part per million of something actually is. So for those of you that are spatially inclined, 1 part per million is 1 inch in 16 miles. One of my favorites is it's 1 car in bumper-to-bumper traffic from Cleveland to San Francisco. For those of you that are time inclined, it's 1 minute in the span of 2 years. So this is a very, very small amount, Bobby, as you referenced. Right. And it's important to keep that in mind, keep those analogies in mind when we get into the actual exposure limits for the chemicals that we're talking about.
Yeah, it is helpful to think about that to have a hazardous exposure, you don't have to have like your nose in the canister of 100% concentration of something. Like it can be out in the air and still do some damage. So
which please don't do that either.
Right. So that's OSHA. There are some other organizations that get thrown around a bit, like NIOSH, or in a previous episode you mentioned ACGIH. How do they fit into this regulatory landscape as well?
Yeah, so NIOSH is the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Similar to OSHA, they conduct research and they make recommendations for preventing workplace injuries and illnesses. Relevant to chemical safety, NIOSH puts out something called the IDLH, or the immediately dangerous to life and health level. So similar to how it sounds, this is the concentration of a particular chemical at which your life or health could be impacted. I think importantly, it's also the level that could prevent your escape from a particular situation. So even if the concentration of that chemical at that level might not be significantly harmful to your health, you might not be able to get out of that situation because, for example, your eyes are stinging and watering and you can't find the door. So there's a wide definition for what the IDLH actually is. Bobby, you mentioned ACGIH. That is the American Conference for Governmental Industrial Hygienists. And they put out something called threshold limit values. So these are similar to the PELs and STELs that OSHA puts out. They're recommendations for what you can safely and reasonably be exposed to over a given time period. I think it's important to note that these organizations all reference each other. So for example, if you go to OSHA's website and you look up what's the permissible exposure limit or what's the short-term exposure limit for parasitic acid, you'll see that there's not one, actually. And we'll talk about why that's the case in a later episode. But OSHA does reference the ACGIH threshold limit value, or TLV.
Okay, it's all one big team. Yeah, like we talked about in a previous episode about the general duty clause applying. So some of these maybe non-regulatory standards from professional organizations certainly do come to bear in some senses as we look at that picture. All right, well, I hope everybody has got their full belly of breakfast on definitions from today's episode. So to bring it home a little bit as we kind of tease what we're moving towards into the next episode, can you give us what some of the specific numbers and exposure limits are for the chemicals that we're going to be primarily looking at in this series, which is hydrogen peroxide and peracetic acid?
Yes, we'll dive into each of those in turn in the next two episodes. But so for hydrogen peroxide, the permissible exposure limit is 1 part per million in terms of a time-weighted average over 8 hours. Curiously, there's no OSHA short-term exposure limit, but you've got some states like Washington State and Hawaii, for example, that said we're not going to wait around for OSHA to do that. They've established their own, and that's 3 parts per million. ACGIH actually recommends a STEL for hydrogen peroxide of 5 parts per million, and they're following a general rule of thumb there that the STEL should be no more than 5 times the PEL. And then finally, NIOSH has set an immediately dangerous to life and health level for hydrogen peroxide at 75 parts per million. For parasitic acid, I mentioned that there's no OSHA PEL. That may surprise some listeners given how frequently it's used. But I can tell you that the last time OSHA PELs were updated was 1971. So there other organizations have stepped up, like ACGIH, and they've put out a threshold limit value of 0.4 parts per million. That's a 15-minute time-weighted average. That's a STEL. And then NIOSH has actually put out a recommended IDLH for parasitic acid that's currently under review, and that's 0.64 parts per million.
Okay, well, we'll dive more into those numbers in the coming weeks. Alex, by the end of this, I think you and I are going to open up a spicy wings shop for chemical safety folks, and the hottest wings are going to be called immediately dangerous to life and health. All right, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Beyond Clean Expert series. If you have any questions about chemical safety or any questions specifically about permissible exposure limits, I'd encourage you to reach out to Alex directly. You can find his contact information in the video description below. I hope you've been enjoying this series. If you have, you can find each of the videos that have been recorded up to date at beyondclean.net. Stay tuned each month for these episode releases, and until we talk to you again next time, keep fighting dirty.